Welcome to the Arabesque Scissors YouTube channel. I'm Ellie Phillips, and in this video I'd like to introduce you to the Blithe Bucket Bag. Now this bag is a large drawstring bag, perfect for storing works in progress, and as you can see it's really beautiful as well. Now I love designing products that are very useful, and so I'd like to tell you a little bit about the features of this bag. Now on the front you can see we have a large cathedral window. And if you followed along with some of my earlier patterns, you'd realise that I love cathedral windows, and the method that we use to construct this is really simple. And if you're a little bit intimidated by this, then you only need to make one. Also on the front, I've featured a beautiful needle turn applique panel, and this is completely optional, but as you can see, it's a really lovely finish to the bag. So I've pulled some of the colours from the exterior print here and featured them as the colours on the front of this window, and this just gives a really nice effect. Now on the back of the bag we have an external pocket and a flap. So there's 3 sections to this pocket, and this is really good just for popping your keys and phone in if you want to take this out with you. It's also great for storing extra notions and even a bar of chocolate. So there's 2 handles for this bag, so it's easy to carry. There's a drawstring that we also make in the pattern, and a really cute connector that joins them together, and you can really add your own fussy cut flair to this if you would like. So the second option that we have for this bag, if you would rather not do applique, is to feature a fabulous fussy cut. So this is a beautiful print that you can just cut out and show on the front, and this is perfect if you have a favourite fabric that you would like to feature, and that's a lot of F's. So I've made this version in waxed canvas, and as you can see this gives a really modern and industrial flair to the project and completely changes the look of it. Now if you love organisational sewing videos that help you grow in your knowledge and level up your skills, I'd love you to give this video a like and hit that subscribe button. Now I've rated this project as a confident beginner, and so if you are good at following instructions and able to follow a pattern, you are going to be able to make this bag. So follow along with the videos that I've made here today, and I can't wait to see what you make with this bag. So let's start with the parts of the pattern that you're going to need to print. So you can print the whole pattern if you'd like, but if you'd like to save paper you can just print the templates at the end. And I do also recommend that you print this cutting sheet which has the cutting table, so you can tick these all off as you cut them out. And you'll see here at the top of this sheet there is also a label diagram where all the parts of the bag are labelled, and you can see exactly what part is called what. And so you can see what I'm talking about when I'm referring to the binding or the pocket or the front A or front B, and you can get a really good idea of just the spatial layout of the bag, and you can colour this in if you like, just to see how your fabric might work with your particular design that you've got in mind. So moving on to the interfacings that you're going to need. So you're going to need 1 metre or 1.1 yards of SF101, and this is just a really great interfacing for backing or woven cotton so that it doesn't sag and stretch. And this is Pellon CF808, which is just a medium weight fusible non-woven interfacing, and this just adds a little bit more structure without it being too rigid, but also just giving a little bit more support. And then we've got a fusible fleece, and this one just gives a nice loft. You can also substitute foam for this if you would like, but that will give quite a dramatically different effect, but that's really up to you. I've added the fleece for this just to give it a little bit of loft, a little bit of slouch, but not too stiff a bag. So here I've got all the bag cut out, so I'll just quickly run through all the pieces that you're going to need. So this is a front A piece, you need 2 of them, and the appropriate cuts of interfacing. the front B piece, so 2 of them, and the interfacing. This is my window in Applique, and I'll be showing you how to trim that down to size. Here we have the lining with the fusible fleece, and the back panel with the fusible fleece and the interfacings. This is going to be my contrast window, so you need 4 of them. This is my pocket, so I've got a front and a lining and all the interfacing that you need for that. These are the casings, so you need a front casing and a back casing. These are my handles and the interfacing that you'll need for that. And a flap, so I've got a front flap and a lining flap and interfacing. And here we have the wider binding A, so this is the length cut on the bias for this, and this is the narrower binding B, and the pattern only calls for 9 inches of this. But if you would like to add the pretty trim that you see on the handles of some of the samples that I've made, you're going to need to cut 30 inches extra of binding B to add to these handles. This is the fabric that I'll be using to make my drawstring ribbons out of. So you're going to need to cut enough fabric at 1 1/4 inches wide to make up about 2 inches of fabric. So you can piece these together, and I'll be showing you how to do that. Now, if you've made an applique panel to go on your front window of your bag, you're going to need to trace the front window panel here. So you're going to just lay this back over and line up all your pieces of your applique here with the design that you can see here. Just get it all lined up. Then you're just going to trace that window and now you can go ahead and cut this out, and this will all be ready to put on to the front window of your bag. Now, if you'd like to do a fussy cut window on your bag instead of an applique panel, it can be quite helpful to choose a fabric that's got a nice large picture print on it. And what I've provided for you here is a template to help you cut this out. So what you're going to need to do is print out this template, checking that it is at the right scale square size, and then you're going to cut these out and join them together. And then you're going to cut out that center window, and this leaves you with a very nice frame to put over your fabric so that you can audition all of the prints and parts of the fabric that you might like to use. So just imagine that I've pressed all this nice and flat. I can see exactly what's going to fit inside my window here. I'm not distracted by anything on the edges here. And this gives you a really nice idea of how it's going to look before you actually cut it out. So once you've just decided on the part of the fabric that you like, you're just going to trace inside the window here, and you can cut that out, and that will be the perfect fussy cut to go on the front of your bag. Okay, so now I've got my front A's and front B pieces, all with their SF101 fused on the back in the center of the fabric. So you're going to lay these out in a grid here, where you've got 2 A pieces at the top. I'll just play around with that a bit till I'm happy with, I think that's facing the same direction. And then you're going to have 2 front B pieces underneath. So here we've got the 4 contrast border squares that are going to become the frame of the window for the bag. So what you're going to want to do is fold each of these in half diagonally, and depending on the fabric that you're using, it might not matter which direction that you're folding this. If you've got a stripy fabric and you would like all the stripes to face the same way, maybe going across or going down, you will have to play around with this until you see that you've got everything facing the same direction. So what I'm going to do now is take these squares that I've folded into triangles and press them so that they're nice and flat. So now I've got my squares that I've pressed into triangles, and I'm going to lay these with the two raw edges facing the inward corners of the two top sections here, and this triangle with the raw edges facing the two inner corners of this one. And sometimes I can see a bit of a alignment issue, so I can see whether the grain's going a particular way. So just play around with this if you can notice that you'd like your fabric facing the same way. It's not a big deal if you get it facing a different way, but just pay attention. If you've got stripes, you might like to have them all going down or all going across. 4 triangles, all aligning with the inner raw edges of each square. And then we're going to take this to the machine and we're going to baste along these 2 inner raw edges, these 2 layers together at an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. So here you've got your 4 triangles now sewn on. So we've got a folded edge here that's loose on all 4 of these, and we're going to sew these squares together into a 4 patch. So just place your top 2 squares right sides together and clip them together with a couple of clips. So make sure you're aligning everything really well, because what we're hoping to achieve here is to get these 2 top points on this section to meet up perfectly if possible. So just add a few clips down the side of here, and then repeat this for the bottom 2 squares. And you can check how closely your sides are going to align just by lining these raw edges up and then rolling that back, and then just you can see where that seam allowance is going to meet, and that's pretty spot on. So you just put a clip on top of that. So now we can take both of these to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch down these 2 seams at a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So now I've got these first 2 pairs joined, and I've pressed my seams open here just to spread out some of the bulk of these extra layers that we've got in the middle here. So just flip these over. So you've got 2 open folds here, top and bottom, and we're going to join these 2 pairs together just by placing them right sides together, just aligning that center seam as best as we can. So just open that up until you see that that's aligning, put a clip on there. Now this isn't so important because this will be covered by the front window that we've prepared, and the more critical that we want to have aligning are these top and bottom points here. So just fold those open and line those up just to check that you're going to get them as close as possible. And just do your best, and you'll be fine. So we're going to take this to the sewing machine and stitch down this raw edge at a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So now this panel is joined and I've pressed this seam open as well. So you can flip that over. You've got a nice central window here. So now you can take your fussy cut or applique centre and place this on the centre of this folded diamond that we've just assembled. So just line up every point on each of these 4 points and then just grab some glue. You can pin this if you'd like, but there is a little bit of bulk to get through. I'm just going to dab a bit of this into the centre here just to help tack this in place. So just realign all this again, pushing this down, and you can see this is going to look really, really pretty. So you can give this a bit of extra glue if you'd like, just to hold those points in place. Now this is where the magic happens. So you're going to take your folded edges that have been loose and we're going to baste this over the edges of the fussy cut or applique centre that we've got here. And because this is a biased edge, this is going to fold back very nicely. And what we're wanting to do is make sure that when we fold it back, we're also catching all of these corners right at the top here. So this is going to taper as you come to the corner into a point and just cover that edge, and then this edge is also going to fold over and cover that first one, so that there won't be any raw edges shown from this centre that we've put on here. So this is where I like to grab my glue, and I'm just going to place a bead of glue very thinly along one edge, and then just starting right in the centre, I'm going to push that down. I'm not going to pull this back too much so I get super close to my applique there, and that's really just going to depend on what shape you've got on your centre here. So you might be able to turn back a bit more of this. So just give that a really good push down to hold that in place. And the aim is that you are going to want to try and make this taper the same on each of the corners here. So just eyeball this. You can pull it off and start again if you're not happy with what you've done here. So then I like to flip this around, and I'm going to work on this edge now. So just run your bead of glue along there, and then just start in the centre, just folding that back, then move up to one of the corners and just pull that down, making sure that that's covering that whole corner there, and then work your way along to the other one. Pushing this into place, and so you can actually take this to the iron net and give it a press, and that will help set the glue even quicker. So we're just going to take this remaining two edges and just glue them into place. So just overlap that top corner there. Give this a little bit of extra glue if it's not staying in place. And then just the final edge here. Now I'm just going to open this up and do this one again, because I've realised once I've done the other three that I've probably turned over a bit much of that one. So you can totally do that. If you want to start again, now if you want to take this to the iron and give it a press, that's fine. Otherwise we're going to start stitching right on one of these points, exactly where this all intersects with the main fabric, and we're going to stitch very close to this folded edge all the way up to the second point and back, follow that around up to this point, follow that around up to this point, and all the way back to where we started from. So now we're ready to cut out the bottom two corners of the bag here for the front panel. So make sure that you have your panel facing the right way up, with the two front A sections at the top and two front B sections at the bottom. So make sure you're not cutting these corners out of the top section. So we're just going to measure a 2 1/4 inch square and mark this on each of these bottom corners. And then you're going to want to grab the fleece panel that you're going to fuse behind the front panel, and you're going to mark the same corners out of the bottom section of this. So just check that you are doing this out of the width of the fleece panel here. So now we're going to fuse that onto the back of the front panel here, and make sure you're aligning that. Now before you fuse the interfacing onto the back, we're actually going to cut out the box corners for the bottom of the bag. And so you'll find that the back panel is actually very similar in width and in length, but not exactly. So it's very important that you do cut the bottom corners out of the width of the fabric and not out of the length. And this will help if you've already cut your directional print a particular way. You'll be able to see that this will be the bottom, or this will be the bottom, depending on which way you've got your fabric facing. So you're going to want to mark a 3 1/4 inch square on each bottom corner here. So just double check your measurements that you are cutting it out of the width of the fabric. So just go ahead and cut these out. And you can see that I've already gone and cut out the interfacing bottom corners here, and you're just going to repeat this for the fusible fleece. So now you can go ahead and fuse your SF101 to the wrong side of your fabric. Make sure that you're centering this in the center, and you should end up with a 1/4 inch seam allowance all the way around the fabric. And after you've fused that, you're going to add your fleece on top of that layer, and then we can set this aside. So we're going to mark the placement for the snaps on the flap here by lining up the template over the fabric that we've cut out here, and then just pushing our pen through the center of that dot until we can feel that's gone through and made an indent. And you can darken that indent from the other side. Just enlarge that dot. And now on the exterior of the pocket, we're going to mark 5 inches across and 1 1/4 inches down from the top edge. So just pay attention if your fabric has got a directional side that you would like facing up. Make sure you've got the top edge marked here, and then just repeat this for the other side. 5 inches in and 1 1/4 inches down, and you're going to center this center hole here over one of these marks that you've made on the flap, and to mark inside of each of these side slits here, and that will be where you cut to make the holes for the prongs to go through. So just repeat that over the mark that you've made for the other side. So give a really good mark there in those side slits there, and repeat that for the pocket. And where have we gone here? Here we are. So just centering that hole, center hole over the dot that you've made, and then marking those side slits. Now I like to cut the marks for the holes for the prongs using my seam ripper. You can just use any pair of sharp scissors, but just poke that in there and just very gently just slide that across just a fraction, and then just do a little test by seeing whether you've cut enough, whether those prongs are going to fit in there. So that one's good. Just repeat that with your holes for your second slit here. So just pushing very gently, and then just check with either of the snaps here. We're not worrying about which is which at the moment. Just check that that's going to go through properly. So just repeat this for this pocket panel. So now's where you need to pay attention to which of your snaps is which. We're going to be putting the female snaps onto the pocket, and the male snaps onto the flap here. So take the part that sticks out and push that through, and repeat that for the other one. And then if you like, and this is optional, but because we're just dealing with a little bit of fabric here, I like to actually reinforce the backs of my snaps here just with a bit more interfacing. So just take a little scrap of interfacing and just place your washer on it and just trace those little side slits that we've got on the sides there. And then just take your seam ripper and just cut those slits as well. And then you can just slide that over those prongs just to give a little bit more support for the washer here. And if you've got any sticking out here that's sort of going past the edge of the flap here, then just trim off any little bit that you don't want to just be sticking out there. So now you can go ahead and put your back washer over the back here. So sliding that on, and then if you're strong enough you can do this with your fingers. I find it depends on the brand actually. Sometimes I use the back of my scissors if they're strong enough, just to spread those open. Just find a tool that is going to help you do this. Just push them as flat as you can get. And we've got both of those nicely set in to the flap. So just go ahead and poke your female snaps into the side of the pocket. I can't see where my slits are because my pattern is in the way. Okay, so then you can add your extra piece of interfacing over the back of each of these. And put your washers on the back. You can also optionally add an extra piece of fleece just to protect the inside of the pocket here. So I'm going to go and fuse mine down. You can actually use any kind of thicker padding or interfacing that you've got. You can glue this on if you like, but just go and hold that into place, and that will just protect the inside of your pocket as you're sliding things in and out. They're not going to snag on the back of this. So now we're ready to assemble the pocket together. So just make sure that the exterior of your pocket is right side up and that the top edge is facing at the top. And then you're going to take the lining of your pocket and place that right side down so that these top edges are aligning. And we're going to clip this together along the bottom edge here. And we're going to stitch down this edge at 1/4 inch seam allowance. Now take your flap sections and we're going to place these right sides together So you just clip these all the way around, just lining up all of your edges. And we're going to baste this together along all 4 edges so that we join the lining and the exterior together. Now just take your pocket and open it out so that the right sides are facing up, and give that bottom seam a press, and then we're going to fold that back in half, wrong sides together, and press along that bottom seam, keeping everything aligned. So then we're going to clip around these 3 sides and baste around these 3 sides with an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. You need to just double check that your snaps are going to meet up properly, and you might need to just do a little bit of what I call training of your snaps. Just depending on how much your fabric is stretching, how your interfacing is all playing together. Even though you've measured accurately, occasionally you might need to just give something a bit of a stretch or just sort of wiggle it in. But your fabric is going to learn where it needs to go. So if you just persevere, you'll find that your snaps will line up properly. So now we're ready to prepare the binding that we're going to be adding to the pocket flap and the pocket. And you've got a couple of different options here. So some people prefer to stitch their binding onto the wrong side of the fabric first. So stitch that onto the wrong side and then flip it over and stitch it onto the right side. And you can see in this particular bag that I have top stitched this on the machine, and if you can do this neatly, this is a really nice look. And this is just one effect that you can get if you stitch your binding this way. On this bag, I've stitched it first onto the front of the fabric and then flipped it over and top stitched it onto the back of the fabric. And this way I've got no stitches showing. I've stitched in the ditch along the edge of here, and you can see that that gives quite a different effect to the finish of the binding. And then in this option you can also hand stitch this if you wish, and then you won't have any stitches showing at all. So this really is up to you. For this particular version of the bag, I'm actually going to be demonstrating this model where I'll be stitching it onto the front of the fabric first, and then flipping it over and machine stitching it onto the back. So there's two widths of binding that we're dealing with here. This one is 2 1/4 inches wide, and this one is 1 1/4 inches wide. So this one is called double fold binding, and this just means that we're going to be folding this in half lengthways, wrong sides together, stitching through both layers of this, and then flipping this over, and then top stitching this or hand stitching it, depending on your preference. And this method is really nice for finishing the edges of bags. So when I grab my pocket here, I can see that this is going to be long enough to bind the whole top edge of my pocket here. And also, if I just do a quick dry run around the edge of the flap here, I can see that I can get all of the binding from my edge of my flap out of this piece here. But if you find that you do need to join these together, so if you find that you do need to join your binding, you're going to just lay your pieces so that they butt up like so. Then we're just going to flip these right sides together so that they're going to form a mitre. I'm going to overlap these, and where the points of these cross at each of these sides, I would clip these together and rule a line from that point to that point and stitch these together. And that's how you're going to join your binding if you need to. So if your lengths of binding are long enough, we're going to take these to the ironing board and press these in half, wrong sides together, so that we've got half the width of binding that we started with. Now just take a short length of binding B, and you only need about 9 inches for this. And I'm just going to trim these pointy edges off here. And when I do this, I only press under one edge on this because this is going to be the edge that I'm going to fold over eventually. So just keep your fingers out the way of the steam if you've got steam going like me, because it'll bite you. And press under just about 1/4 inch. And then when we sew this on, I sew this on this edge so that when we're ready to flip, this nice pressed edge is already ready to go. So now just grab your pocket and your flap, and we're going to attach the binding. This is binding A, and what I've done is trim this just so it's slightly longer than the top of this edge here. So just place these right sides together along this top raw edge, and I'm going to be clipping from the right side. So sewing along the right side and then turning over to the wrong side to stitch this down. And just grab the flap of your bag here, and just starting on the right hand edge here on the right side, just place that raw edges together with this overhanging just about 1/2 inch or so, and just start clipping towards this curve here, stopping just before you get to the curve. And then rather than stretching this as we go around, we're just going to just make sure that this just fits. We're sort of going to ease it, because if we stretch this too much as we go around this curve, then it's going to pull the pocket in and it won't sit flat when you're finished. So just use plenty of clips as you're going around here, and just sort of almost push this back to where you're coming from as you go around here. And then as you get to the straight edge, you can open this out a bit more. And you don't need so many clips. And then as you come up to this one, go back in and just put a few more clips around the curve here. So as long as you've made sure that you haven't stretched this too far around here, then you'll end up with a binding that fits nicely as you go around. So now we're going to take these both to the machine and we're going to stitch at a 1/4 inch seam allowance along all of these raw edges. Okay, so now just give your binding a press from the side that you've stitched. That just helps set everything in place. And then I'm going to give it a light press as I open out the binding along here. Then I'm going to turn this to the back and press this, just covering that row of stitches that I've done showing through from the front. And you can see that that's going to look really pretty. Then I'm going to grab my glue here in my handy dispenser and just run a bead of glue just above that row of stitching that you can see showing through from the front to the end, and just press that into place, making sure that you're just covering up that line of stitching. And now that's ready to be stitched down. So I'm going to be stitching this from this side, and I'm going to be stitching right in the ditch along the edge here, knowing that my stitches are going to nicely catch on the back here. And if they don't totally catch, you're actually not going to see it because they're going to be on the inside. So just repeat this with the flap. So just give those stitches a press and then just flip all that back over to the lining side. And you can see here that even though I've eased this around here, around these curves, this is actually quite a tight fit, which is really good because you don't want it to be too floppy. But if you stretch this too much, this is really going to buckle up. So just fold this back over so that it's just covering that line of stitching. Give that a press. And then you can just sneak back in underneath that layer and add some glue just inside that stitching line. Just a really small amount. Don't want it to be squeezing out and showing where it's not supposed to. So push all that back down, making sure that you are covering that stitching line. And then just hit that with the iron again. And now I'm going to take this to the sewing machine and stitch in the ditch all the way around that edge. And you can see this is looking really nice. So just take your flap here and trim off any excess binding that you've got here. level with the top of the raw edge on the front, and trim off the binding level with the sides here on the pocket. Now we'll set that aside, and we're going to deal with binding this top edge that we've got here. Now this really just depends on what your preference is, because most of this binding is going to be on the inside. So I'm going to just clip this right sides together, aligning this raw edge that I haven't pressed up with the straight edge of the top of the flap here. And then I'll just trim off the excess here just a little bit longer. So now I can take this to the sewing machine and stitch along here at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, so I'm just going to trim this side off just a little bit more, so we're down to about 1/2 inch on each side here. And I'm going to take my glue, a couple of clips here. I'm going to start by folding over this excess that we've got on the side here. So I'm just going to pull that to the inside and make sure that this edge is not sticking down lower than the level of the stitches that I've got here, and also making sure that this top edge is also folded inside the amount that's on the fold here. So all of this is fitting in inside this amount. So you're not going to see any of these folded edges that we've tucked over here. So now we can take the glue and glue the rest of this down. So just run a bead of glue just above that stitching line showing from the front, and then just start pulling this over until you can see that you're covering that line of stitching. And I'm just going to hold that in place just for a bit with my binding clip, and go back to this side. Clip that in place, and then just tuck all this under. And then you're just going to press that. So now you can stitch this either from this side or from this side, doesn't really matter. This is going to be on the inside of the flap, so when we stitch this to the bag you won't see this first line of stitching that you're going to do. So now take the back panel of your bag that you've prepared, where you have fused your SF101 and then your fleece, and then you have cut out your bottom corners from your bag. So make sure it's lying right side up. with the top of the bag at the top here. And you can take your pocket, and we're going to place this onto the lower half of the back panel here, and we're going to place this 3 5/8, so just over 3 1/4 inches above here, so that this bottom seam here is not going to interfere with the corners here when we box these corners. So I can see here by placing my ruler here, this is 3 5/8, and we're just going to clip this together to the back along these side edges, and we're going to stitch down one set of raw edges here at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and then we're going to stitch all the way along the bottom seam here at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and back up this second side basting here at 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now we're also going to add some side pockets here by stitching a channel on each side here. So you're going to measure 3 1/2 inches in from each side edge here. So just mark a line with your ruler here. So as well as stitching along these 3 sides here, we're also going to stitch from the bottom to the top to form 2 extra pockets in this long pocket that we've got here. Now I'm just marking the midpoints here for my bag, just by measuring along here and marking the centres right through the vertical centre here. I'm also going to mark the centre on my flap here just by folding this in half and drawing a line with my pen here. I'm going to use a few pins for this, just because we can't clip right along here. So I'm going to align my centre here that I have marked with the centre here on the pocket, and I'm going to make this to measure 3/4 of an inch up from the edges of my pocket here. So you just double check that that's going to be straight with your ruler on the 3/4 of an inch line there. And now I'm not going to pin these all the way through, because pushing that through is actually going to move the whole thing. So I'm just going to keep it there, just holding that, and we're going to stitch now along the same line of stitching that we've stitched as we did this binding B here, and then we're going to stitch a second row of stitching very close to the top edge of the flap, and we're going to stitch through all the layers so that this stitches the flap to the back of the bag. So I've got everything stitched down here. You can just give your snaps a bit of a dry run here. Might take a little bit of a wiggle just to get them in place to start with, but as I said before, you are going to train this flap where to go. So give everything a pull if you think it needs to stretch out a bit more, or just a wiggle, and then you can just get your iron and just lightly press that. Now I don't want us to crush this fold where the flap is folding over and press this really sharply. I would like to keep a little bit of a curve there. So you can just let that set as it cools down, and you'll find that very quickly that flap just falls back into place and snaps very nicely.